Winter, 1945, somewhere outside Dessau, Germany. The war is ending, but the sky still smells of fuel and loss. A team of Luftwaffe engineers trudges through the mud of a fog-covered airfield. Ahead of them, a shape half buried in the earth. Enormous, twisted, silent. It isn't German. Its aluminum skin gleams through the mist, curved like nothing they have built. The wreckage of an American B-29 Superfortress, a machine they had only heard about in whispered reports from the Pacific. One engineer kneels beside the broken nose section, brushing soot from a circular pane of glass. He peers inside. The cockpit is pressurized, sealed like a submarine. Wiring runs in perfect bundles, painted, numbered, clean. He takes off his gloves. The metal feels impossibly light, impossibly strong. For a long moment, he says nothing. He just looks at a world of design and precision that no longer belongs to Germany. And in that quiet realization, beneath the gray European sky, he understands. This isn't just a bomber. It's proof that America cannot be defeated. The question remains, how did this flying fortress come to exist at all? To understand that moment, the engineer, the wreck, the silence, we must return to a time when the world itself was being remade through metal, fire, and willpower. By 1942, the air war over Europe had reached its brutal crescendo. Germany's Luftwaffe still held prestige, but its confidence was crumbling under the endless rhythm of American bombers. The B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator flew from England in waves that never seemed to end. For every one shot down, two more appeared the next morning. Yet, even as Germany pushed to improve the Messerschmitt 262 jet or the V-2 rocket, a quiet revolution was already underway on the other side of the Atlantic. It began not in a laboratory, but in a factory. Boeing's plant, Tissing. Two, in Seattle, where America's industrial war machine was shifting from enough to excess. The United States was preparing something entirely new, a bomber that could fly higher, faster, and farther than anything the world had ever seen. It would not merely strike cities, it would reach across oceans, directly from one continent to another, with precision, endurance, and unprecedented firepower. That project was the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. Its creation was not just engineering, it was logistics, a kind of organized chaos powered by a nation untouched by invasion and fueled by limitless resources. When President Franklin Roosevelt approved the design in 1940, Boeing engineers were handed what seemed like an impossible brief: a bomber that could carry 20,000 pounds of bombs more than 5,000 miles, and do it faster than any interceptor could reach it. America accepted that challenge in the way only it could, with factories, not speeches. At its peak, more than 60,000 workers labored around the clock in Wichita, Renton, and Marietta. Men, women, and even students trained in technical schools to assemble rivets, hydraulic lines, and pressurized cabins. The production cost, nearly $3 billion, made the B-29 the most expensive weapon of the war, second only to the atomic bomb project it would one day carry. But the true genius of the B-29 was not in its size or speed. It was in its design philosophy. Where German aircraft were engineered with elegance and complexity, the B-29 was built for efficiency, reliability, and scale. Its cockpit was fully pressurized, allowing crews to fly above 30,000 feet without oxygen masks. Its defensive guns were remotely operated by sighting stations controlled through an analog computer, a technological leap that stunned even the most advanced Axis scientists. Each of its Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines produced over 2,200 horsepower. giving it a cruising range that stretched from the Marianas to Tokyo and back. While Germany fought to keep pace, America was learning to mass-produce precision. Each rivet hole matched perfectly, each component interchangeable. It was a symphony of standardization, a philosophy German engineers found alien, even reckless. To them, craftsmanship was sacred. To America, production was power. By 1943, the B-29 was no longer a prototype. It was a shadow forming over the Pacific, a symbol of a nation that had learned to turn imagination into industry at a pace the Axis could not comprehend. For the men on the ground in Europe, the B-29 was a rumor, a myth, a bomber so advanced it sounded like propaganda. Reports described it as a fortress above fortresses, invisible to flak, and beyond fighter range. The Germans didn't believe it existed. Until one day, in late 1944, it fell from the sky, a single B-29, damaged and lost on a mission from China, crash-landed in Japanese-controlled territory. From there, fragments, photos, and technical reports began circulating across the Axis. And eventually, as Germany's own world collapsed, those fragments reached Europe, and the hands of engineers who had once believed no one could surpass German precision. They were wrong. If stories like this move you, consider subscribing. We'd also love to know, where in the world are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments now. Let's dive back into the story. The news first arrived in Germany quietly. A report forwarded from their ally in the Far East. Japan had recovered the remains of a downed American bomber near the coast of China. It wasn't like the B-17s or B-24s the Germans knew. The dimensions were enormous, the structure alien, and the level of refinement unbelievable. The aircraft was identified as a Boeing B-29 Superfortress, one of the new bombers the Americans were using in the Pacific. For German engineers who had lived inside the logic of the Luftwaffe's design philosophy, the discovery was more than interesting. It was shocking. Technical drawings began circulating among intelligence units in Berlin and Dessau. Reports described materials and construction methods far beyond anything Germany could replicate by that stage of the war. The fuselage used advanced aluminum alloys. The fuel systems were self-sealing, redundant, and layered for safety. Every cable, pipe, and hydraulic line was color-coded and numbered, a level of organization unheard of in German aircraft, which often required hand-fitting and specialist maintenance. At Junkers and Heinkel, engineers gathered to study the data. Some dismissed it as American exaggeration. Others, after reviewing the photographs and field notes, grew quiet. It wasn't simply that the B-29 was better. It was that it had been built differently. The Germans had always equated engineering superiority with complexity. More moving parts, tighter tolerances, higher craftsmanship. The Americans had pursued something almost heretical to that tradition: simplicity that worked. The B-29 systems were modular, standardized, and replaceable. A damaged turret, an engine, or an entire control section could be swapped in hours instead of days. That kind of design could only come from a country that didn't fear waste because it could afford abundance. Meanwhile, in America, new B-29s rolled off production lines like automobiles. Factories in Kansas and Georgia produced dozens each week. Every unit left the line identical, compatible, ready. No other nation in history had ever achieved that kind of consistency. Not even the United States before the war. For the German engineers, who were now working under bombardment, the contrast was almost painful. Their own designs, the Me-262 jet, the Arado R-234, the V-2 rocket, were brilliant but fragile. They needed scarce alloys, skilled labor, and constant maintenance. Every bomb that fell on a factory or rail line meant fewer aircraft, fewer engines, fewer chances. The B-29 represented the opposite. It was the culmination of a system that could outbuild, outlast, and outfly anything Germany had. When fragments of one crashed aircraft finally arrived in Europe through technical exchange with Japan, the reality became undeniable. The German engineers examined the structure firsthand: the rivet spacing, the wiring harnesses, the pressurization seals, and realized they were looking at something that had been designed not by genius, but by a process so vast that individual brilliance no longer mattered. It was industry elevated to strategy, production as a form of warfare. By the winter of 1944, the war was turning irrevocably. American bombers darkened the skies over Europe, while in the Pacific, B-29s struck deep into the Japanese home islands from bases thousands of miles away. And though the Germans never faced the Superfortress in combat, they understood what it meant. In every plate of polished aluminum, in every precisely stamped component, they saw the reflection of a country that had turned industrial might into destiny. It wasn't about one bomber. It was about a civilization that had learned how to make thousands. As one German engineer later recalled in post-war interviews, "We built aircraft like craftsmen. They built them like a nation." He paused before adding, "That's when I realized we had already lost." The men who gathered around the B-29 wreckage were not ordinary soldiers. They were veterans of a war fought with pencils and blueprints, engineers, designers, and test pilots who had once believed they stood at the summit of mechanical civilization. For nearly a decade, Germany's aviation industry had been the envy of the world. From the clean lines of the Messerschmitt Bf-109 to the experimental jet projects at Peenemünde, their aircraft reflected the nation's identity: disciplined, inventive, elegant, and uncompromising. But as they examined the American bomber, something inside that confidence fractured. The first reaction was disbelief. The B-29 structure seemed impossible. Too large to stay aloft, too smooth to have been built by hand. When they opened a pressurized crew compartment, the realization struck harder. This was an aircraft built to carry its men through the sky as if in a submarine, at altitudes their own fighters could barely reach. Every inch revealed a kind of thinking that Germany, in 1944, could no longer afford. Inside its fuselage ran neat bundles of numbered cables. The fire control computers were compact and standardized. The Americans had managed to turn complexity into routine, something the Germans had never imagined could be done at such a scale. They compared the B-29's construction to their own Heinkel, A-177, or the Me-264 America bomber prototypes. Aircraft that looked impressive on paper, but rarely survived long enough to prove their worth. Where German bombers were plagued by engine fires, vibration, and maintenance chaos, the B-29 systems were laid out for endurance and serviceability. One Luftwaffe colonel, examining the remote-controlled gun turrets, reportedly muttered, "This isn't an airplane. It's a factory in the air." He wasn't wrong. The B-29 was the first aircraft in history to combine automation and coordination at such a scale. Its central analog computer, the General Electric Central Fire Control System, allowed gunners to target enemy aircraft from sighting stations connected to multiple turrets. The system calculated range, speed, and trajectory almost instantly. Technology decades ahead of its time. For German engineers used to manual precision and pilot skill, this was something close to heresy. They had built machines that demanded mastery. The Americans built machines that multiplied it. And yet, behind the technical astonishment was a deeper human reaction, a quiet kind of respect. The men inspecting the wreck knew what they were seeing wasn't luck or magic. It was the product of a nation that had chosen function over pride. Germany's design culture had always prized perfection. The flawless line, the exact fit, the ideal material. But by 1944, perfection had become a curse. Factories were destroyed, aluminum scarce, and every improvement demanded time Germany no longer had. The United States, in contrast, pursued a different religion: sufficiency at scale. If a part was good enough to work, it was produced by the thousands. If something broke, it was replaced, not refined. It was a philosophy born not in desperation, but in abundance. The engineers standing in that cold hangar were confronting more than an aircraft. They were facing the idea that victory belonged to those who could build without stopping. One of them later reflected, "We were still building machines like artists. They were building machines like farmers, planting, harvesting, replanting. That is how they won." Technically, the B-29 was not invincible. Its engines overheated. It required enormous logistical support. But even those flaws revealed the scale of American capacity. Entire factories existed just to produce spare engines, entire ships to carry replacement parts across oceans. And that realization hit harder than any bombing raid. The Germans were brilliant, but they were few. America was vast. Its workforce, its materials, its factories, its time. The Luftwaffe's top scientists knew that even if Germany could design something equal or superior, it would never exist in numbers enough to matter. The B-29 was more than a machine. It was the industrial spirit of America turned airborne. Standing in that hangar, surrounded by twisted metal and shattered pride, the engineers felt something rare for men of their craft: humility. The kind that comes not from defeat in battle, but from witnessing a new age being born before their eyes. And it was only beginning. Because beyond the wreckage they studied, thousands more B-29s were already in the skies, flying higher, faster, farther. Soon they would reach the very heart of Japan, rewriting the final chapter of the war. To truly grasp the meaning of the B-29, one has to leave the airfield and look back, across the Atlantic, across the factories, across the America that built it. It wasn't just a plane. It was an industrial miracle, the product of an entire civilization moving in one direction. In 1943, Boeing's Wichita plant covered nearly 2 million square feet. Every morning, tens of thousands of workers, mechanics, welders, clerks, and housewives flooded through its doors. Many had never touched an aircraft part before the war. Yet, within months, they were producing one of the most advanced flying machines in history. On assembly lines stretching half a mile long, the B-29 took shape in rhythm. Wings attached, fuselages rolled forward, engines mounted. Unlike Germany, where production depended on a few master engineers and craftsmen, America had turned mass participation into mastery. At each stage, men and women were taught to specialize. One drilled holes, another wired circuits, a third polished aluminum skins. It wasn't artistry, it was choreography. And when the final bomber rolled out into the sunlight, it wasn't just the work of designers, it was the work of a nation. For every B-29 that took off, there were millions of hands behind it. Factory workers, railroad crews, oil drillers, farmers, and miners. That was America's real advantage. Not genius, not luck. Infrastructure. The B-29 embodied the idea that strength wasn't about invention alone. It was about scale, repetition, and supply. By the time Germany's engineers examined the captured wreck, the U.S. was already producing thousands of bombers, fighters, and transport planes every month. No empire in history had ever moved industrial weight with such coordination. To the German mind, this was unthinkable. They had pursued technological supremacy as an art form. America treated it as an equation: problem plus resources. plus speed, plus victory. Even the smallest details of the B-29 told that story. Where a German aircraft might use hand-fitted panels, the B-29 used standardized sections. Where Germany's jet turbines relied on rare alloys, America built piston engines from what was available. Simple, abundant, repairable. The contrast revealed something profound. The future would belong not to perfectionists, but to producers, and this realization carried an emotional weight far heavier than metal. For the German engineers, it was a kind of mourning, not just for their country, but for their idea of what engineering meant. They had spent their lives chasing precision as a form of beauty. Now, in the cold silence of a collapsing Reich, they saw that beauty alone could not win a war. The B-29 wasn't beautiful. It was efficient, and in that efficiency lay power. Beyond technology, there was the psychological angle. The message the B-29 sent to both enemies and allies. When reports of its capabilities reached Europe, it was described as a weapon from another century. Flying higher than flak, faster than most fighters, it carried destruction across distances no previous aircraft could dream of. To the Japanese, it seemed supernatural. To the Germans, it was confirmation that the war had become a contest no longer of courage, but of capacity. The B-29's range, altitude, and bomb load rewrote the geography of war. For the first time, an enemy could strike another continent from the air. Without bases, without carriers, without rest. This was the dawn of the global battlefield, and everyone who studied it knew the world would never shrink again. Even the Soviet Union took notice. Stalin ordered his engineers to replicate the B-29 after 3 emergency landings in Siberia. They reverse-engineered the aircraft down to the smallest screw, producing the Tupolev Tu-4, a nearly identical copy. It was the highest form of flattery, and proof that the B-29 was not just a weapon, but a template for the future. And then came the moral angle. One no engineer could escape. For all its brilliance, the B-29 would end the war not through precision, but through devastation. From its bomb bays would fall the firestorms over Tokyo and, finally, the atomic bombs that erased Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Erdinbandhuenfurn was the paradox of progress, that the same technology that represented human triumph also delivered human tragedy. To the German engineers, who examined its wreckage in 1945, that paradox was clear. They admired it as creators, yet recoiled from what it had enabled. Because the B-29 was not just a machine, it was the proof that technology had outgrown morality. It was no longer about who could design the best aircraft, but who could build the most powerful system and live with its consequences. And in that understanding lay the quiet truth that haunted them all. They hadn't merely lost a war of nations. They had witnessed the birth of a new kind of world, one where the future would be decided not by armies, but by industries. By mid-1944, the B-29 was no longer an experiment. It was ready to go to war, but not over Europe. Its true stage would be half a world away. The vast blue emptiness of the Pacific. Germany was already collapsing under Allied air power. Japan, however, remained defiant, its cities unscathed by direct American bombing. The problem was range. No existing bomber could reach the Japanese home islands from any Allied base. That changed when the Marianas Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam were captured in a brutal series of battles that summer. The islands became America's unsinkable aircraft carriers, only 1,500 miles from Tokyo. From there, the B-29s could finally do what they were built for: bring the war to Japan's doorstep. The first missions began in late 1944 under the command of General Curtis LeMay, a man known for his relentless focus on results. At first, the operations were plagued by problems. The massive Wright R-3350 engines overheated and caught fire. Crews struggled with malfunctions, high-altitude winds, and Japanese fighter resistance. But America could afford to learn through failure. Dozens of damaged aircraft were replaced weekly. Crews were retrained. Tactics evolved. Within months, LeMay realized the answer lay not in altitude, but in adaptation. In March 1945, he made a decision that changed the air war forever. Instead of high-altitude precision bombing, he ordered low-level night raids using incendiary bombs, exploiting the B-29's massive range and payload. The new strategy was brutal in its simplicity. On the night of March 9, 1945, more than 300 B-29s took off from the Marianas, heading for Tokyo. Each carried a mixture of high explosives and jellied gasoline bombs designed to ignite the wooden structures of the city. They flew in silence, stripped of defensive guns to save fuel and increase bomb load. What followed was the most destructive air raid in human history. In just 3 hours, over 100,000 civilians were killed, and more than 16 square miles of Tokyo burned to ash. The heat melted iron, turned canals into boiling rivers, and left the city glowing red against the horizon. From above, the American crews could see the flames merging into one vast firestorm, a single, living entity devouring everything. It was the moment when the B-29 fulfilled both its promise and its curse. LeMay's campaign continued relentlessly. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama, one by one, Japan's cities fell under waves of B-29s. By the summer of 1945, nearly every major urban center in Japan had been destroyed. From the perspective of the engineers who had once built aircraft in Germany, this was incomprehensible. They had designed weapons for tactical victories. The Americans had built machines for strategic annihilation. War on a scale no nation had ever attempted. What shocked them wasn't only the destruction, but the precision of the system behind it. Every B-29 in the sky represented a factory, a fuel convoy, a pilot school, a logistical network that stretched across oceans. It was warfare executed like an industrial process. Efficient, repeatable, unstoppable. As news of the Pacific firebombing reached Europe, it was studied with a mix of awe and horror. German air officers understood instantly what it meant. Had the war in Europe continued longer, this same storm of aluminum and fire would have fallen on Berlin, Hamburg, and Munich. One Luftwaffe officer, reading an American intelligence summary after the war, wrote bitterly in the margin, "If they had finished the B-29 1 year sooner, Germany would have ceased to exist." He wasn't exaggerating. Even without the atomic bomb, the B-29's long-range capability and sheer production volume could have erased any remaining German resistance by late 1945. And yet, behind the destruction lay an almost eerie detachment. The men who flew the superfortresses described their missions not as acts of vengeance, but as assignments, checklists, flight plans, coordinates. It was war reduced to procedure, destruction carried out with mechanical calm. That was what made the B-29 different from any aircraft before it. It was not merely a machine of war. It was a system of systems, the manifestation of what happens when a nation industrializes not just production, but death itself. To the German engineers who would later examine its wreckage, that realization was perhaps the hardest to accept. For all their brilliance, they had never dreamed of creating something so vast, so impersonal, so efficient. The B-29 was proof that war had entered a new era, one where victory belonged to those who could organize chaos into rhythm, turning destruction into industry. And in the final months of 1945, That rhythm reached its most terrible crescendo, because soon one of these silver giants would carry a weapon unlike any the world had ever seen. And the German engineers, watching from a defeated Europe, would finally understand what America had become capable of. August 6, 1945. A quiet morning over Hiroshima. At 8:15 a.m., the sun was already climbing over the mountains when a single silver aircraft appeared high above the city, so high that few even noticed it. It was a Boeing B-29 Superfortress, call sign Enola Gay, flown by Colonel Paul Tibbets of the U.S. Army Air Forces. It carried one bomb, just one. Inside its bay rested a weapon that no one in the world, except a handful of scientists and generals, truly understood. The bomb was codenamed Little Boy, uranium-based, designed by the secret Manhattan Project, the culmination of years of theoretical physics and unimaginable funding. At 8:16 a.m., the bomb bay doors opened. A black shape dropped silently through the clouds, a small object falling toward the city's morning bustle. 43 seconds later, the world changed forever. A white flash lit the horizon. The sky seemed to collapse, then expand into a rising column of fire. The blast wave leveled everything within miles: concrete, steel, and flesh. Hiroshima ceased to exist. The energy released by that single bomb equaled more than 15,000 tons of TNT, all delivered by a single aircraft, powered by 4 engines and a nation's industrial might. 3 days later, August 9, 1945, another B-29, Bockscar, commanded by Major Charles Sweeney, took off from Tinian. Its target was the port city of Nagasaki. This time, the bomb was Fat Man, a plutonium implosion design even more powerful than the first. At 11:02 a.m., the second atomic flash tore through the clouds. The explosion turned the valley into a cauldron of fire, killing more than 70,000 people in moments. By evening, Japan's leaders had no illusions left. The empire that had vowed to fight to the end was suddenly staring at the end of the world itself. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito addressed the nation. His voice trembled through static. The enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb. Should we continue to fight, it would lead to the total extinction of human civilization. The war was over. When news of the atomic bombings reached Europe, the world paused. Even in the ruins of Germany, where factories still smoked and cities lay in silence, engineers and soldiers alike tried to comprehend what they were hearing. The B-29, the machine they had studied and admired, had just become the instrument of an event that transcended war. For the German engineer who had once touched its metal skin on that muddy airfield in Dessau, the realization returned, colder, deeper, final. He had thought the bomber itself was the limit of human invention. Now it was clear. It had only been the vessel for something even greater. A convergence of science, industry, and willpower so immense that no nation on earth could resist it. He read the reports in disbelief. One aircraft, one bomb, one city gone. No raid, no armada, no battle, just silence, followed by absence. That was when he understood. America had not just defeated its enemies. It had redefined the meaning of warfare. The German engineers who survived the war would later speak of the B-29 with a strange mixture of awe and regret. They had seen genius before, in rockets, in jets, in guidance systems. But this was something else entirely. This was a nation that had learned how to fuse every strength: science, industry, manpower, and imagination into one seamless force. Even Werner von Braun, Germany's leading rocket scientist, would later remark after joining the American space program, what the B-29 proved was that industry could do what genius alone could not. The Americans had created the blueprint for the modern world, a system where invention was only the beginning, and production was the true weapon. In the ashes of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the age of the B-29 ended almost as soon as it had begun. But what it represented, the industrialization of innovation, would define everything that followed. The Cold War, the nuclear arms race, the space race, the digital age. For the German engineer who had once studied its broken shell, the thought lingered. His nation had built the most advanced rockets, the fastest jets, the most elegant machines, but it had lost to something far simpler, far more unstoppable. Not perfection, but production. Not design, but discipline. He looked at the photograph of the B-29 again. The smooth rivets, the polished nose, the twin-tail shadow, and realized what it truly symbolized. Not America's bomb, not its weapons, but its ability to make dreams into reality faster than anyone else could imagine them. The war had ended, but the message of the Superfortress was eternal. Whoever controls production controls the future. May 1945. The guns of Europe had fallen silent, but the engineers' war was far from over. In the ruins of Germany, Allied teams moved quickly, searching laboratories, airfields, and underground bunkers for documents, prototypes, and, most importantly, people. The scientists and designers who had once served the Reich were now prizes in a new, silent competition. Who would capture the minds that had driven German innovation? Among them were men who had stood over the wreckage of the American B-29 only months before. Now they found themselves face to face with the nation that had built it. This operation had a name: Operation Paperclip. Under its cover, hundreds of German engineers, scientists, and technicians were secretly brought to the United States. Some were interrogated. Others were offered work, new identities, and a second life. They came from the same world that had birthed the V-2 rocket, the Me-262 jet fighter, and the Panther tank. But in America, they discovered something profoundly different. A culture where technology was not the privilege of the few, but the power of the many. For men like Werner von Braun, who had led Germany's rocket development program, the move was a revelation. At White Sands and later at Huntsville, he saw factories larger than entire towns. Production lines dedicated to turning theory into mass reality. It was the same system that had created the B-29, now redirected toward the next frontier: space. In interviews years later, several former Luftwaffe engineers admitted that examining the B-29 had been their turning point. They had realized that the war had not been lost in the air or on the ground. It had been lost in the factory. One recalled, "We built aircraft that required the best men to fly and the best craftsmen to maintain. They built aircraft that anyone could fly and everyone could build." It was a statement both admiring and mournful, because behind the technical genius of the B-29 lay something Germany had never mastered: the democratization of engineering. In the United States, innovation was not confined to secret research centers. It flowed through universities, industries, and training programs that reached every level of society. That was the real engine of American power. Not the weapon itself, but the system that allowed thousands of minds to work toward a single goal. For the German scientists now living in that system, it was like stepping into the future. Some helped design new bombers and engines for the U.S. Air Force. Others joined early jet and missile projects that would become the backbone of the Cold War. Their skills, once used to fight against America, were now being used to help it stay ahead of the Soviet Union. whose own engineers had copied the B-29 into the Tupolev Tu-4, a near-perfect clone. The irony was not lost on them. The aircraft that had once symbolized their defeat had now become the foundation of the very world they lived in. But perhaps the most haunting part of their reflection was philosophical. Many admitted that the war had taught them something technology alone could not answer. That invention without conscience was only half of progress. They had built marvels for destruction, and in the end, they were defeated by those who built faster, not necessarily better. In one interview decades later, a former Junkers engineer summarized it quietly. The Americans won because they built with faith. Faith that their machines would work, and faith that if they didn't, they would build better ones tomorrow. It was the lesson of the B-29 distilled into a single sentence. The faith not in perfection, but in persistence. In the years that followed 1945, the B-29 did not fade into memory. It became a blueprint, a foundation for everything that came next. The aircraft that once carried bombs across oceans now carried lessons across generations. For the United States, the Superfortress was both an achievement and a stepping stone. Engineers at Boeing and the newly formed U.S. Air Force studied every detail of its performance, its flaws, and its endurance. The result was a direct descendant, the Boeing B-50, an upgraded, faster, stronger version that continued flying well into the 1950s. But the true legacy of the B-29 was not mechanical. It was ideological. It had proven that the future of war would be decided not by the bravery of individuals, but by the efficiency of systems. Factories, fuel depots, data, and logistics would become as decisive as any general or battlefield. Across the ocean, the Soviet Union reached the same conclusion. When 3 B-29s made emergency landings in Siberia during the final months of the war, Stalin ordered his engineers to copy them down to the last bolt. The result, the Tupolev Tu-4, became the USSR's first true strategic bomber, identical in shape, size, and capability. It was both a tribute and a warning. The industrial era of warfare had gone global. From that point forward, every major power would measure its strength not by the brilliance of its scientists, but by the scale of what it could produce. And yet, beyond the competition, there was another story, one of reflection. As the jet age began, many of the same engineers who had once studied the B-29 shifted their focus from destruction to exploration. Von Braun's rockets, built first as weapons, now pointed skyward toward the moon. Aerospace pioneers on both sides of the Iron Curtain shared one unspoken truth. The technology that once burned cities could also carry humanity beyond them. It was an idea born from contradiction, that progress and devastation were twin forces, born from the same human hands. By the 1960s, the B-29 was fading from active service. Some were used for weather research, others as reconnaissance aircraft. A few were scrapped, their aluminum recycled into new wings for the next generation. But its shadow remained, not just in hangars or museums, but in the DNA of every bomber, airliner, and spacecraft that followed. Its pressurized cabin became standard in commercial aviation. Its remote gunnery systems inspired the first unmanned control interfaces. Its modular design philosophy paved the way for the mass production of jetliners and rockets. Even the cold precision of its missions, once seen as mechanical detachment, evolved into a philosophy of automation, guidance, and data-driven warfare that defines the modern age. For the German engineers who had once stood in awe before its wreckage, this transformation was bittersweet. They had lived long enough to see their former enemy's machine not just conquer war, but transcend it. The very same principles that had crushed the Reich, mass production, standardization, and systemized design, were now the engines of peace. progress, and exploration. The B-29 had started as a weapon of dominance. It ended as a symbol of transition, the moment when humanity crossed the line between mechanical invention and industrial civilization. In every way that mattered, it changed the course of history, and for those who understood what it truly represented, the union of will, science, and scale, it was more than a plane. It was a prophecy that whoever mastered production would one day master the stars. Years later, the German engineer would walk through a museum, one of the new American exhibits built to celebrate victory. Behind the ropes stood the familiar silver curve of a B-29 Superfortress. Its skin gleamed beneath soft lights, polished not by war, but by memory. He stood there for a long time. His hand trembled slightly as he reached out, not to touch, but to trace the air in front of it. The same gesture he had made years before in the mud outside Dessau. Back then, it had been wreckage, twisted metal, soot, defeat. Now it was history. He realized in that quiet hall that the true difference between nations was never just in what they built, but in why they built it. Germany had pursued perfection, chasing mastery one machine at a time. America had pursued possibility, an idea so vast that no setback could stop it. The B-29 was the embodiment of that idea. Not the bomb it carried, not the destruction it unleashed, but the belief that progress itself could be weaponized. That if humanity learned to build faster, farther, smarter, there would be no limits left. It was a terrifying truth, and a hopeful one, because the same hands that built weapons could one day build bridges between nations, between stars. He turned from the aircraft and walked toward the exit. Outside, children were laughing. The sound of a world that had survived. Above them, a jetliner crossed the sky, its silhouette smooth and silver, pressurized, efficient, an echo of the same design he had once studied in awe, and he smiled faintly, because in that moment he understood. Defeat had taught him something victory never could. That greatness is not measured by genius alone, but by the courage to build, rebuild, and keep building, even when the world has burned around you. The sky remembers everything, and so do we. Subscribe to WW Tales Stories and join us as we uncover more untold moments of courage, loss, and discovery from the war that shaped our world. What part of this story moved you most? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to read your take.